So good evening. My name is Bart Thurber, and I'm the Ann Hendricks Bass Director here at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. And it's truly my pleasure to welcome all of you. In particular, I want to extend special thanks to our guest speaker, Aaron R. Turner of the University of Arkansas, who, among his many accomplishments, I'm convinced undoubtedly brought us today's weather. I noticed that today was the exact same temperature at Fayetteville as it was here in Poughkeepsie. This is the last time that we will see these temperatures for some time, so thank you very much, Aaron. I just wanted to give you a special shout out there. More seriously, of course, he is here tonight with Dr. Jessica Brier to celebrate her remarkable exhibition, On the Grid, Ways of Seeing in Print, which I know all of you have just had a chance to see. Jess's exhibition is the latest in a long and distinguished history of photography and print-based exhibitions here at the Loeb, whose origins date back to the founding of the college nearly 160 years ago. The Vassar Art Gallery, as it was known then, held several photographs since its founding in 1864 and periodically mounted special displays of the medium. However, it was not until 1973 that the gallery purchased a large number of works by living American artists with funds from the Charles E. Merrill Trust that Vassar began regularly acquiring and exhibiting photographs. Ultimately, in 1999, the Loeb established an advisory council whose donations and advocacy have led to the acquisition of hundreds of photographs, including several featured in On the Grid. For nearly a decade, Ann Haney Hoy, class of 1963, has served on the advisory council and been a stalwart supporter and charitable donor. In 2015, she established a generous endowment to provide resources for the exhibition of photography, including this latest project, which was also funded by the Friends of the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. Since Dr. Brier first proposed the exhibition in April of 2021, I went back to my emails, it was the 5th of April, 2021, 18 months ago, which is quite remarkable. She received invaluable assistance and encouragement from a wide array of campus partners, such as Andy Ashton and Ron Patkus in the library, Gary Hohenberger and Christina Johnson in the grants office. Additional collaborators included Laura Newman and Jordan Etzel from the art department, Nicole Beveridge from the Atlanta Center, and Danushi Fernando, LGBTQ+ and Women's Center, who helped to promote this evening's event. Dr. Brier is the latest curator to focus her sharp eye and considerable expertise on the collections of the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center in order to develop a superb show and impressive scholarly catalog. She was hired in June of 2020 as our inaugural Deknatel Curatorial Fellow in Photography after completing her PhD in art history at the University of Southern California. Since her arrival, Jess has truly energized, and I have that underlined in my notes here, truly energized the Loeb's teaching, research, and presentation of its distinctive holdings, now numbering over 5,000 works, as well as inspired the entire team in myriad ways. I can't even begin to enumerate her many contributions during her short 2.5-year tenure here, so let me just say thank you, Jess. Finally, it gives me enormous pleasure to announce tonight that thanks to a lead gift from James Kloppenberg, class of 1977, who is also with us tonight, who previously served as the chair of the Photo Council for a number of years and now is a member of the Loeb Leadership Council, we will be creating our first curator of photography position for an initial 3-year term. James's generosity has been key in promoting further study of the medium, supporting its development, and encouraging active engagement with photography on campus and beyond. So my last thank you is to James Kloppenberg. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jess Brier.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to echo Bart's words of welcome and thank you for your presence today. And I have many people I'd like to acknowledge, and I promise to be as brief as possible. An exhibition is a collaborative endeavor on every level, and this one benefited from amazing contributions from each and every one of my colleagues at the Loeb, past and present. I especially want to thank John Murphy and my former intern, Massimo Tadiras, a class of 2022 who's here tonight, for their beautiful writing for the catalog and exhibition. Eleanor White and Diane Tenorelli for framing and installing the exhibition, attending to every last detail. Cheryl McMahon, Kelly Reynolds, Kayla Shipsky for shepherding the project along, Matthew Woodard, Amanda Potter, Ian Shelley, our guards, student guides, and student committee for engaging with visitors, Francine Brown for everything you can imagine, including promotion, as well as Alex Raz and Claire Arndt, and of course to Bart Thurber and Mary Kay Lombino for all of their support of this project. I'm also grateful to our book and exhibition designers, whose work I think you all enjoyed in looking at the show, Beverly Joel and Diane Gottardi, and our editor, Kristen Swan, and our partner at Scala Arts Publishers, Jennifer Norman. Many, many colleagues at Vassar contributed ideas and feedback for the project. I'll just name a few. They include Kate Sussman, Tobias Armborst, Liz Lastra, Gordon Hall, Adedoyin Tariba, Tom Hill, Rick Jones, Dean Rogers, and Sam Spears. And finally, I'm grateful to each of the artists who contributed their writing to the catalog. You'll see small snippets of that writing on the screen in the next few minutes. And I'm, of course, grateful to each and every artist whose work is represented in the show. And I'm honored that several of you are here tonight, so thank you. Okay, so before I introduce our guest artist, Aaron Turner, I'll offer some general remarks about the exhibition and its ideas. And then after Aaron's talk, we will sit down for a conversation and invite you all to participate. Let me begin with a question. What kind of way of seeing is the grid? This is a question that I asked myself while scouring the Loeb's collection, seeing grids everywhere, as I do. It's a question that I pose to artists directly, and it's a question that I continue asking of visitors. What kind of way of seeing is the grid? Aaron Turner's response is one answer to this question. Aaron calls the grid the perfect game for the studio environment. Let's talk about games for a minute. Like grids, games can be freeform, opportunities for open-ended play and, in Aaron's words, infinite possibility. But games are often tightly controlled, adhering to a strict set of rules and regulations. And of course, games can also be rigged by design. Aaron's approach as an artist served as something of a model for me as a curator. He thinks about how form is always embedded with assumptions and values. Aaron uses images as tools for looking at received histories. His work makes plain that abstract art is not apolitical, and it never was. In Questions for Saul, which is the work you see on the left, he borrows the visual language of Saul LeWitt. LeWitt embraced geometric abstraction by writing and adhering to strict, self-determined rules, creating abstract forms according to systems with their own internal logic. Aaron asks us to consider who gets to write their own rules, who is celebrated for embracing self-determination, and who is not. Through projection, reflection, and reconfiguration, he has transformed LeWitt's clean lines. A moire pattern interrupts pure geometry. This interruption flags the disorienting experience of trying to play a rigged game that, like the grid, is generally trusted as neutral. Op and pop artists have similarly activated the disorienting qualities of geometric form. They remind us that looking is not a function of a disembodied eye, but rather something physical, embodied, and contingent. Looking is an act of vulnerability. It is personal. We may all look at the same thing, but we will never see it the same way. Grids are also a form of repetition. Anne Thompson suggests that in the act of repetition, there is a thin line between pattern and compulsion, between the rational and the irrational. Grids are fascinating to me because they contain these opposite impulses: control and disruption, clarification and distortion, conformity and idiosyncrasy, understanding the world as it is and imagining what it could be. Stephen Fraley writes that seeing is chaotic. Grids offer an antidote to that chaos, especially in photography. In 1972, John Berger wrote that every image embodies a way of seeing. In the West, we use grids to make sense of things, to organize, categorize, and rationalize. By putting things into boxes, we try to make them manageable. What could be more disheveled, more unruly, to borrow Stephen's words, than human beings? Despite the complexity of bodies, humanity, and nature, grids allow us to make rational comparisons and tell stories that we can follow and repeat. But of course, putting things into boxes and repeating the same things over and over and over can be its own kind of madness. For me, nothing illustrates this more vividly than images that deconstruct vision itself, like halftones and lenticulars. They force us to recognize how images, like so much else, are just barely being held together. Like looking at a stereograph, we often rely on images to trick us into seeing clearly. For some artists, putting images into boxes demonstrates something we already know intuitively. The grid offers the illusion of control, or rather, it offers control as an illusion. Instead of seeing the grid as a fixed frame, Jared Bark took it as a provocation, a gate I could push anything through, he called it. Like flowers that overtake the human body in death, or the form of the ear that looks stranger and stranger when collected and repeated, humanity pushes through and breaks free. Werner Pfeiffer also sees the grid in architectural terms. He calls it the scaffolding of our visual perception. Like a gate, scaffolding is rigid but permeable, a perfect metaphor for the typographic grid, which is maybe the most powerful of the invisible grids that govern perception. Legibility itself depends on the grid. By turning type into abstraction, Pfeiffer and Elizitsky offer legibility of text as a choice. It's something we can opt into or reject. Rhiannon's Guide to Foya understands the grid's legibility in a different way. She proposes that rather than try to suppress complexity, the grid can instead make the intricacies of life more legible, that is, seen and understood. The grid's infinite capacity can be a path towards self-liberation. Sometimes that path begins with unacknowledged histories. Tafoya claims the patterns and techniques of Cherokee basket making as family heirlooms. For Susan Silton, stripes are laden with the long history of marking queerness as social deviance. Abstraction is not apolitical, and it never was. Perhaps the most radical gesture is to see the grid not as a form of discipline and order, but rather as the territory of mystery and subversion, again to quote Anne Thompson. For Stephanie Sejuko and Alison Rossiter, the photographic grid holds the possibility of seeing the past as ever present. These artists show that the grid can be a disruption, and maybe an exhibition can be a disruption as well. So now I'm going to switch gears and introduce our wonderful guest artist. Aaron Turner is an artist, educator, and writer. He is the founder and director of the Center for Art as Lived Experience and the Photographers of Color podcast at the University of Arkansas School of Art, where he serves as assistant professor. He uses photography and projection to create still life studies on identity, history, Blackness as material, and abstraction. Aaron earned his MA from Ohio University and an MFA from Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University. He's been awarded many residencies, fellowships, and grants from numerous places, including Lightwork at Syracuse University and FOCO, Artist 360 Mid-America Art Alliance, Visual Studies Workshop Project Space, Aperture Foundation, and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Aaron Turner.
It seems like every time you get ready to speak, something gets in your throat, so try not to cough through this. But Jess, thank you so much for that generous introduction and just the invite to be a part of the show and everyone involved in bringing me back here. I used to work at Bard for a number of years, and I do consider the Hudson Valley a second home, so it's really, really good to just be back here in this capacity. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. So going to the first question that Jess posed for the show, I wrote this text for the catalog, and I'm going to read it for you as a part of answering this question that's on the screen now. How can the grid be a form for liberation and play? But in response to the question for the catalog, when Jess asked me to write about the grid, what is the grid form to you? How do you see it? How can it be interpreted? And the full response from the catalog that I wrote was, the grid is seeing infinite possibilities. My first interaction with the grid was through the work of MacArthur Binion, a black man from Mississippi. I didn't know these two things when I first saw the paintings that he created. Binion is one of many artists whose minimalist aesthetic spoke to me on the first encounter. When minimalism and abstraction intersect, space for ambiguity and contradiction and perception come into play, bringing content back into the form. Agnes Martin is associated with the grid. But what I like most about Martin is that she disappeared, leaving everything behind. It makes me think of Stanley Whitney's journey, moving from New York to Italy in the 90s. In his words, things came together. The grid is also a game, maybe the perfect game for the studio environment. Perhaps that's why I'm fond of chessboards, thinking about Fluxus, John Cage, and Marcel Duchamp's game of musical chess. Then enter David Hammons, and so much more. So one of my first encounters with the grid just in my own work was through this grid of faces from this 1952 Ebony Magazine article that was titled, Which is Negro, Which is White? And it's this quiz about the act of passing, and how I came to use abstraction in my work was through these ideas of passing. And our American history is like riddled with these, with references to passing. If you think about Plessy versus Ferguson, even things like the Brown versus Board of Education, the NAACP, and just so many different things ingrained in history. And so when I first encountered this grid of faces, it made me react to the folks that were present in this grid, but in an isolated manner of this way. So ended up taking all those faces and kind of regridding it through these different processes in Photoshop. And actually, I think 4 of these were on view here at the Loeb a few years ago. So my relationship to the museum goes far back, and I'm glad to still be in conversation. And this also talks about how I use the grid to interact with the archive itself. And then in this pattern here, this is an image I created that's looking at the legacy of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And there's a grid that I created basically in Photoshop, thinking about the way that MacArthur Binion makes paintings. And then, as you'll see in a few slides, And then also intersecting the grid with the archive in a very specific way in this last image, looking at Herman Shaw. Herman Shaw was one of the last living members that was a part of that was unknowingly a part of the Tuskegee experiment when they went into this specific community of black people and injected them with syphilis, and they had the cure eventually throughout this unknown experiment to the folks in this community, which was penicillin. But they just kind of looked at how syphilis impacted their bodies and everything without even giving them the cure. Herman Shaw was one of the last folks that was around from that community, present day, and I think got the medal, one of the presidential medal from Barack Obama when he was president. So, but the light that is shown over the face that creates this very like bright highlights and dynamic shadows over Herman Shaw's face was just a natural occurring grid due to a particular architecture and a particular position of the sun. So part of that grid was in my control and out of my control and kind of occurred naturally, and it's just something that I'm naturally drawn to. So the grid can occur organically, or it can be superstructured and planned out. So the grid continues to follows me through my practice, or I'll follow it through my practice. So in this painting here from 2015, the use of Braille as an aesthetic choice and a conversation specifically with abstraction for disguising purposes. So those are very specific words for a very specific meaning, but it's disguised to most viewers because most people don't read Braille as visual people. And so how direct does one choose to be with their work? And so what do you choose to conceal and what do you choose to reveal when you present work? In the other side, you see Untitled 2015, but in this case, I'm appropriating the grid style of the artist MacArthur Binion again. So I'm so obsessed with this grid, and I'm so obsessed with how he constructs his grids and the shapes of his paintings and his origin of the Mississippi Delta. I'm from the Arkansas Delta, and his thoughts about the labor in painting. Those are two things that really continue to draw me to his work, to the point I directly appropriate it and use it as a backdrop for the still life idea that I had. So that's what I'm doing in that section there. And then with these two images here, Questions for Saul is in the show, but there's actually an image that goes along with it called Thomas LeWitt from 2018. So I'm talking about two artists in one frame, both in abstraction, using abstraction, making work around the same time, one black, one white. So I was looking at a practical, literal sense of, for example, with Thomas LeWitt image, I'm looking at the legacy of Alma Thomas as the first black woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And then I'm looking at that legacy compared to the works of hers that they have in the collection, which is only one painting, compared to the legacy of Saul LeWitt, which they were showing his work since his mid-30s and have, I think, almost 130 works or over 130 works in their collection compared to Alma Thomas. So I always think about how history positions the importance of other artists over one another, especially in relationship to them making and producing work around the same time. And so I'll stop there on that one, but that's a little bit of thinking behind that one. Then also, I make a bunch of different works. This is the first time I made a titled work called Post Reflections. But Post Reflections is kind of me thinking about the term post-minimalism and this idea of conceptual art and the term modern or modernist. So I still don't really understand what it is, but I keep encountering it in my research, and I haven't defined it for myself yet. So I'm going to continue to engage with that. Moving on to part of answering that question that I posed at the beginning of the slide, I'm going to go through several artists' work, and I kind of just want to read aloud things about the artist. Some things I'm going to read are directly from the artist, some things are from other people, and you'll notice what I'm reading by the bottom left hand of the slide, where I'm reading from and where I'm getting my sources from. But I want to talk about the artist Adam Pendleton, who uses this framework of freedom and abstraction, or people refer to his work about as a style of freedom and abstraction, but he also directly refers to his work about being about the past and the present simultaneously to think about the future. And that is something that I borrow from him for my own practice and why I engage with archives constantly, very consistently in my work. But I'm just going to read these two things about the work that you see right in front of you and continue on to the next slide. So referring to this work here, the first one here on the left, Stephen Squibb writes, "If nothing can be more pressing today than the recovery of abstraction as a method of freedom, it is precisely because only abstract work can bring together the conflicting movements of a concept like independence within a common frame. This capacity is the first step towards understanding the world in which we find ourselves, which is itself the first step toward reducing suffering. For those institutions that have relied on suffering or their own profitable existence, there is a vested interest in restricting who has the access to this capacity for abstraction. Pendleton's work demonstrates how this restriction relies on the production of blackness as a kind of incapacity to think beyond appearances." And then referencing this piece here, you see the word independence, but in the French language. Language carries culture, and culture carries particularly through orature and literature. The entire body of values by which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. How people perceive themselves affect how they look at their culture and their politics and their social production of wealth and their entire relationship to nature and to other beings. I'm going to read a quote by the writer John Yao in reference to what the complexities that MacArthur Bingham's work encompasses. This is my favorite painting, or my favorite work by MacArthur Bingham, which is a part of a larger series of paintings that I believe is titled the DNA painting series. And in this detail, you can see this is his birth certificate from the state of Mississippi. So, and then you can see the gridded pattern laid on top of that redacts information, but then when you zoom out of that detail, you see this amazing pattern and this amazing grid that you can in other interviews he talks about the labor in painting and the desire to make a painting that only a black painter could produce. So when I heard him speak about that, I was immediately drawn into it, and I actively paint in my practice as a result of that. But John Yao writes that the part I look, these is a few quotes from MacArthur, and then John Yao's words are in between, so you'll kind of get it. "The part I took from minimalism is that you want to do your own stuff in your own image. In making his own image, he exposes the prejudices and privileges and presumptions inhabiting Frank Stella's famous dictum, what you see is what you see, and Andy Warhol's claim of just look at the surface of my paintings, and there I am. What do these statements mean to a black man growing up under segregation, the struggles of the civil rights movement, assassinations of black leaders, and sanctioned police brutality?" So that's a little bit of words in there from MacArthur Bingham and John Yao, and I think that kind of refers back to bringing content back into a form of abstraction or a form like minimalism that is perceived to not have any content whatsoever. Another artist I want to talk about very briefly because his engagement with the grid stems from 1974 all the way to 1989. So that's just too much to talk about in the time that I have with you tonight. But the way Charles Gaines is thinking about the grid, these beautiful grids, these beautiful images, and there's several of these that he created in between those years, but he's using the grid system as a way to explore or break down the issues of subjectivity or the idea of subjective inspiration. It's a systematic approach to the production of things in the world. And he's also working at a time period where artists are dealing with the term conceptual artists, and he's working up against the backdrop of the black arts movement at this time as a black artist producing work like this, when the call was to make a different style of work at that time for black artists. And that's a little bit on Charles Gaines. And then I really love finding relationships between artists. So you got this article here that I'm gonna read a little bit from. It's called Howardina Pindell, Negotiating Abstraction, and it's by the artist Charles Gaines. So you got artists engaging with one another and writing about each other's work, engaging with each other's work, which is super, super important to what we do as artists. It's something that I really, really believe in. So Gaines is writing about the minimalist and the conceptualist or conceptual art approach of Pindell's work in this essay. The compositional, the aesthetic features, but also this aspect of a discursive enterprise or discursive aspects in the ways in which she's working early on through a system like the grid. So when I use that word discursive, I'm talking about things that happened in the past, things that are happening presently, and then how those two things combined are imagining or creating a pathway for the future. So kind of this idea of self-awareness through the discursive enterprise of artists, and there's several other discursive enterprise in other fields of study and exploration. And he's also talking about abstraction and the perspectives in this idea of modernist aesthetics. That word comes up a lot in the overall essay, but he is talking about, I'm going to read Charles Gaines' words from this essay, and he's actually referencing his own reference, which you'll hear me read about as well. So it reads, how is it that collage in Pindell's work, in Pindell's paintings and graphic works functions discursively and not only aesthetically? As Schwabsky points out, Pindell seems to have embraced both techniques on the level of theories or artistic practice and is clearly not willing to accept that they need to be binary opposites. Her embrace was a matter of her disposition and not a matter of theory. I was very fond of Duchamp's work. That's a direct quote from Howardina Pindell. She has said, I was also very fond of landscape painting. Schwabsky recognized that although these two types of practices were oppositional, for Pindell, the relationship between them made sense. A personal narrative bound them, and her history with them was a part of the development of her identity. Of course, the question is, are they subjectively linked, a matter of her aesthetic affinities, or discursively linked, a matter of social experience? It's easy to say it's both, but intellectual rigor requires us to explain how this squares with the binary that defines the terms as mutually exclusive, as concepts, not as experiences. So that's a more elegant way to kind of discuss that idea of discursive enterprise. And I think is also talking about what Charles Gaines is saying here is like the motivations behind Pindell's work come from these real places of content and her engagement with very specific things in a very, very specific way unique to her. And these are some of her early grid works here. And I'll read this one really quickly. I think I can fit it in just without going over time. But this is another little block from the from the essay by Charles Gaines. It says, "Black aesthetics for me means being conscious of African art. I think using aggregates is African, like mixed media, putting a lot of different substances together. The kind of surface that I used in the late 1970s when I was adding paper and paint was African. I think one can also use abstraction and have a black aesthetic because of the way abstraction has been handled in Africa through the use of geometry and patterns." So that's a direct set of words from Howard D. Pindell within that essay by Charles Gaines. And then I just very briefly, I really could do a whole presentation about Adrian Piper, but again, it makes me really excited and just too much to cover because it's all connected. But Adrian Piper, again, is on this cusp of making this work, again, where this whole new idea of the time about conceptual work or conceptual artists. And so some of the questions that Adrian Piper is asking in her work, going as far back as this, the 1960s, is how do we perceive the world, ourselves? How should we live? How can we become free? So those are like some core questions that Adrian Piper is exploring in her work and has used the grid consistently through her work over the years. And then one other thing that kind of relates back to Saul LeWitt, in 1968, she met and forged a friendship with Saul LeWitt, who connected her with the New York circle of conceptual artists. And she, at one point, was making these wooden wall sculptures in response to one of Saul LeWitt's most well-known works. I think it's called like 3-part Variations on a Cube or something like that. I can't remember the exact title of that, but this was her response to, because of encountering his work. So again, how this discursive enterprise that we find ourselves in as artists, other artists impact one another, and other artists form relationships and friendships that then go on to impact the narrative, the narrative of art history. Now I want to talk about Stanley Whitney really quickly, and I'm just going to read from this essay here because I mentioned them in the writing earlier. But again, I'm kind of going through looking at artists who use the grid and kind of talking directly about the grid, but there's also other interesting things that kind of surround the grid and kind of just speak to what things that they were going through individually and personally in pursuit of things like the grid. So the interviewer here says, Al Loving, who's another African-American abstract artist, Al Loving changed his, let's say, successful geometric abstraction. The story goes that he had a problem reconciling this kind of artwork with the problems of his with the problems of his black community. And then Stanley Whitney responds. Ed Clark, for example, is another amazing black abstract artist, did worry about whether they would get worried about the community, if the community would get what he did as an artist. And Stanley Whitney says, when I was in Kansas City, the one question that I had to always address was, is this important? When the Panthers came around, I told people to tell them I wasn't there because they didn't think my work was important. I thought it was very important, but I couldn't tell them why. Their question was, what did this do for the race? As an artist, I think a lot of people will think art is not important. So you're dealing with two issues. You're trying to be an artist, which is difficult anyway, and because you are a minority and they say you're black, you have to deal with that too. The next question that the interview poses is, what would you say was the breakthrough moment when you found your own visual language in painting? And this is what I was referring to in the writing, I believe. He says, things came together when I got out of New York in the 1990s and I went to Italy. New York really changed in the 1980s. It was Julian Schnabel and that vibe. The bohemian New York was gone. I was struggling with the idea of color and color filled. I wanted things to stay really organic, being in Italy, being away from New York, those 2 or 3 years probably was the most important time for me to start making my mature work. I felt very good in those days. It was nice to be out of the country. Things came together then. And then I just briefly want to talk about David Hammons, because he's also mixed up in that whole late 1960s, 70s, 1970s conceptual artist movement. I think this piece here, like all of these pieces here are different iterations, but the one here that you see on the beach is the one titled Hair and Wire, Venice Beach. But he kept using this wire and this hair that he collected from barbershops throughout the years. He even made more of these that involved like rocks, putting like hair on rocks and using the rods. Like he would revisit that in the early 2000s. But I think this is an example of a loose grid or a free-forming grid, because it appeared in all these different places and different iterations. And it was like this vehicle that David Hammons was working through and kept revisiting as an artist. So I love repetition as an artist, and I just think that's important to point out about David Hammons and how his legacy intersects with that whole post-minimalism movement, and modernism, and conceptual artists. And so he also had an awareness of Duchamp and an appreciation of Duchamp, just like Pendel. So again, that discursive enterprise, being aware of what has already happened before you enter something like the art world, being aware of what has happened already before you signed up to be an artist, and what is happening presently as you make amongst other artists, and then that allows for you to imagine the future, what's to come for artists in the future. And then this is, I got one more slide after this. Just the game of chess, thinking about the artist John Cage and his early scores and experiments about the interpretation of music and all this kind of stuff, and how that influenced the Fluxus movement, there's a George Brecht piece in the show. It's just all these connections that make me really happy. And them taking this act of turning a chessboard into like a sound piece, like an instrument. So you see John Cage and Marcel Duchamp there playing this musical chessboard. And I think there's an audio file you can find on SoundCloud. And then this is a recreation that someone created most recently, contemporarily, of that whole game. But this idea of grids and games and aesthetics and the whole meanings behind them and different things like that. But Duchamp comes up several times and intersects with all that stuff. And then also, this is my last slide, so I just want to mention and reiterate the archive, reiterate the practical. Like in this first image here, you see me projecting this pattern similar to a chessboard pattern onto different shapes that I typically use in the studio environment, made out of paper and other materials, fabric and stuff like that. But it's basically, if you ever open up a blank Photoshop layer, it's a grid. It's just a grid. It's just a blank, empty canvas that you work from. And so taking that and including it in my image just in this practical way, and understanding, being self-aware of my interests and patterns, and then likening that to, or drawing a connection to, the chess board. Like in middle school, I was in the chess club. You play like an hour or two after school, and I remember doing that for at least like a year or so. And then I've seen different movies about chess, and I've always been drawn to the checkerboard and the chessboard, and kind of the two deviations between those two games, and the meanings behind those two games, the perceptions behind those two games. And then finding these archived images of men who look like me playing chess. So that subverts certain things or certain perceptions due to photographic evidence. But it's really the faces on these two men that really draw me to it, and then playing chess, and then sort of filtering them through my series called Black Alchemy, which is where all these black and white photos are from. And then the use of the grid, the presence of the grid, and the literalness of that, but also the metaphorical qualities of that, and then this whole thing about a game. Because this is a game that people take quite seriously, and it kind of represents a certain thing, and all that kind of stuff. You can kind of fill in the blanks on that, but I have my own relationship toward it by my own past and just other different things that I engage with. But I actively keep like chess boards in my studio. I keep chess pieces in my studio. It's just something that I always need around to look at. It's such a basic form, but so much can be interpreted from it and reappropriated from it and stuff like that. So I think that's everything I had in my notes. And this is my last slide, and thank you so much for listening to me. Appreciate it.
I think this is working, yeah. In the 1970s, Lucy Lopard curated a show called Grids, 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 Grids. And I feel like that could be the title of the talk tonight.
Sounds good.
Aaron, thank you so much. My mind is sort of going in many directions, so I'm not really sure where to start here. I'm gonna ask a couple of questions and then open things up. I hope there are other questions out there. I'm trying to decide where to begin.
It's okay.
I guess I'm interested to hear you just talk a little bit more about abstraction. Mm-hmm. I wanted to sort of ask, do you think abstraction and representation are mutually exclusive or opposite? That feels like kind of a cheeky question because I know you don't think of them in that way. So maybe a better question is kind of what is the role of representation in working with abstraction or working in a non-figurative or semi-figurative mode?
Yeah, I think it's maybe how I would describe it, and I could change the definition tomorrow or next week, because that's just how fluid, that's just how art is. I feel you just kind of have to kind of go with what you're feeling at the time and the things that you're aware of and engage with as an artist. But I think abstraction, as it relates to representation, serves as this way to talk about a lot of complex things. Because when you immediately see like a figure, it already has like these charged things to it. And it's straightforward. It's straightforward at the same time. But then abstraction kind of allows you to fit a lot of complexities and disguise them in a way. You can kind of position yourself or position things within an abstract image to where you are in control of what is revealed to the viewer and what is concealed from the viewer. So a good example I like to use about that is again, Howardina Pindell is a good example. Like, she made all these works with circles. She would punch holes into paper and all this type of stuff. But the circle or the oval for her comes from this moment when she was a child and her father took her to this food stand, and they had all these red dots, these red circles on like the cups and utensils. And that represented things that black people or people of color could use, were allowed to use. And that had, when her father explained it to her, that has such a profound effect on her to where she just uses the circle still to this day. So again, kind of going back to like what John Yao was saying about MacArthur Binion, like, yes, he's making abstract work and he's not necessarily making figurative work, but that doesn't mean that it's devoid of any kind of meaning or content. And so it seems like every black artist that I engage with that uses abstraction kind of has a similar through way of how to use an abstraction. And I think that's why that language of like liberation or freedom through abstraction is an important idea. Because I actually use the figure and abstraction simultaneously in the frame. And then sometimes I use them exclusively apart from one another. So,
And maybe that's also a way of thinking about how you use materials. This sort of moving between abstraction and figuration. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned a little bit at the end your studio practice. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how you're using materials and light and images, and you're obviously looking so much at other people's images, but then really transforming them materially, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think because I use the medium of photography, I get, it's easy to get bored with photography. I always tell people that because it's just like this 2D flat thing, and you can print it out as a piece of paper and you can put it on the wall. But then the techniques of photography, I won't say are not that hard to master, but you can master them pretty quickly, and then you kind of reach this place where everyone's on an even playing field, and it's like, as an artist, I'm interested in being as unique as possible. So that's when I start engaging with more self-awareness. I'm trying to engage with other mediums and forms like painting, and trying to dive deep into things like abstraction in a very obsessive way. And then trying to balance like literalness and metaphorical meanings and like different symbols that I use as an artist to make interesting work, to try to create interesting conversations about work, or to start interesting conversations from work. So I didn't talk about it but a little bit today, but I actually like reading Nella Larsen's novel Passing and Quicksand, and they just actually made like a film based on that novel by Nella Larsen called Passing. It's on Netflix. It's a beautiful black and white film that everyone should watch. Just to even learn about aesthetics of like seeing. It's just a beautifully shot film. But when I engaged with that text as an undergraduate when I was at University of Memphis, it just stuck with me, like that existence of life, like that idea of ambiguity, or how people react to you based on the way you look. And then an artist like Adrian Piper like really gets into that in her work. And so I thought abstraction was the perfect way to talk about the complexity of something like Passing, and then coming across that Ebony magazine quiz from 1952 posing that question, which was normal at the time. In 1952, which is white, which is Negro, and then seeing, but me as an artist and as an individual being drawn to the grid of faces at the same time, and then trying to reappropriate that source imagery, reappropriate the grid for my own interest and my own use. So like the series Black Alchemy is what I filter all those thoughts through, and why I use still life, why I'm interested in minimalism, why I'm interested in painting, why I'm trying to understand what modernism is, exploring like the origins of conceptualism or conceptual artists. Like, yeah, the more I engage with the past, the more I start figuring out like, oh, this is just more to unpack. It's just a never-ending rabbit hole. So that's my practice. That's how I kind of would describe my practice. I really respond to certain kind of aesthetics that I'm interested in, but I also respond to the ways in which other artists make and their words that they use to describe their work.
Yeah, so speaking of that, you talked about Adam Pendleton, and he's, well, you pointed me toward a piece of writing where he says, he thinks of his work as a way of talking about the future while talking about the past, which really strikes me as, I think, a good description of your work. And I assume that resonates with you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other artists who kind of, they say it a different way, but they're basically doing that same thing. And then I think that directly relates to that idea of like the discursive enterprise. How aware of you as an individual of the past, how aware of you of the present, what's happening around you, within your field as an artist and outside of your field as an artist, and then how do you take that and move toward the future or imagine the future I like to use it as motivation to like think about the aesthetics in my work first, and then I kind of build out from there. Like, how does my work look in relationship to or in conversation with all this other stuff that has already been made before I even decided to be an artist? So that's how I think about that work, and I'm always trying to, like, I don't know how to, I'm just interested in other artists. That's why I interview other artists in other capacities and stuff like that. I'm just interested in what other artists do, art making and just art in general. And then all that motivates me in my own practice. So.
Okay, I want to give people a chance to ask questions. Are there questions? I can keep going. I have more. Very quiet. Well, I have a question about photography.
Okay.
So you mentioned, maybe working within the boundaries of maybe what we would call traditional photography. Obviously, that's something you've kind of wanted to break out of, right? and I get nervous about this trust that we have in photography as being transparent. We know that it isn't, and yet we still use it that way. And it strikes me that you use photography in this sort of disruptive way. And I wonder if you can talk about sort of disrupting the expectations of photography or the uses of it.
You have a particular example that you're thinking about?
Well, you talked about appropriating images from the archive, and I'm curious about, that sort of, those sort of distortions of those images, right? Obscuring faces, kind of letting us see some things but not everything, right? That to me seems like a kind of disruption of this transparent idea of photography.
Yeah, I think one way I would start to answer that question is going back to like my first engagement with photography. I was really interested in being a photojournalist at one point. So I would literally, like when I was interning at papers and freelancing and stuff like that, it was really like a daily thing. You had to go out into a community, engage with people. Sometimes you have one assignment that day, sometimes you have 4. So it's like you're just making images. But I was never really satisfied with, like, when it came down to editing and I had to pick one image, or I had to pick a set of images that would go to the photo editor, and then they would pick like one to represent the whole thing. I was never satisfied with just one image representing even just a moment of when a photographer was like present in a place. So that's why I started to enjoy the archive at the same time, because I felt that I was just an image maker dumping a bunch of photos without context into this big void of like image making. And like now, like because of Instagram and all these other platforms, like Facebook and stuff, like just billions and billions of images like daily. What do you do with all that? And then as an artist up against billions of images as an image maker, like in an artistic, like, oh, I'm an artist and I use images, but then there's billions of images every day. So how do you start to separate from that or make sense of that or even use that as a motivation to make work from? So and then also I was just like too aware of like the history of photography, like all the quote unquote great documentary photographies and photographers in the tradition of documentary photography. Again, I just felt like I was like not really adding anything meaningful to that. So from that perspective, I only started doing documentary work in the Arkansas Delta about my own family and about the community that I was from. Because I felt that I could ethically do that and like had a right to do that. But anything outside of that, it was really hard to get myself interested in because I wasn't like from a specific community or a part of a particular upbringing to like turn my camera on it. So after feeling like that, I started to engage with the archive because I felt like the archive, like at these last images that I talked about, is like I don't necessarily have to go out and find young men present day and make images just like that when they already exist in the archive. So they serve as stand-ins for other African American men. They serve as stand-ins for myself, and they have value and can be reused and reappropriated in particular ways that extend the life of the images and just like help us have different conversations like we're having now, just about the use of images and the role of images in society and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. That's how I think about it.
Thanks.
Yes.
I think we have a mic coming to you, Ron.
Thank you both for your talks. The first sentence on the back of the catalog says, "The grid often hides in plain sight." And just as a result of this project, I feel like my own sensitivity has been hugely increased. And sitting in this room, for instance, just a few minutes ago, I realized the ceiling is a grid.
Yeah.
The windows are a grid. The heating ducts underneath the windows are a grid. The floor pattern here is a grid. I think these chairs in their rows are a grid.
Yeah.
The wooden panels in front of the stage are a grid. The chalkboard is a grid. I never would have looked at it that way. I never would have been sensitive to that before this project. That's just a comment more than a question, but maybe you have a thought about that.
No, I was thinking about this room as the same way. Mainly, like, especially from this perspective, like looking at the seats, like going back that way, and then there's a grid of all these lights. I've never seen seats like this before. It's really interesting. And then seeing it down this way with the lights out and stuff like that. But I did notice the ceiling, but I wasn't thinking of it as a grid. I was just thinking of it about a particular time in history and how there's not a lot of this left, different places. So just, I feel even fortunate to just even sit in a building this age, and that's from a particular era like that, but incorporates the grid. Just as a structural, practical component, I think that kind of relates back to what I was saying about Charles Gaines, or what Charles Gaines was saying about his work, like this, like how truly subjective is our influences, and he explored it through the grid, is like using the grid as this mode of production, because it has all these practical uses to it. You can look at it like that, yeah.
Just one last thing. I feel like, so that's the first step, maybe seeing some of these things as a grid. But then the second thing is what you did. Like you said, oh, now that makes me think of history. It's like we're intrigued by it, but then what are our next questions?
Exactly.
Yeah, to me that's kind of one of the more interesting ways, hopefully, for an exhibition to come together, is something that's maybe not what we're putting our attention on, but then when we do, there's a lot of meaning within that. I mean, that I really meant what I was saying about Aaron, your thought process being kind of model for my curatorial process, because I think that's a lot of what's happening with your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is really like you pay so much attention to kind of these embedded meanings that you really have to look for. They're not, they're maybe not apparent, or they have to be sort of brought to the surface in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just like I was talking to you about, just the different things that I'm interested in as an individual and that I engage with as a part of this thinking about discursive enterprise, because I want to know as much as possible. So when I'm looking around the show and I see a Marcel Duchamp, and I see a Saul LeWitt piece and an Aaron Siskin piece, who else was there? Ed Ruschav, and like it's just like all this stuff. Like if you know about it and you engage with it, and it's out there for everybody to engage with through different modes, but that just makes me super, super excited. Like just bouncing off the walls in my head, like, because I've encountered all those things individually and like how it all intersects with abstraction, and then how that is looped back into the history of photography in and of itself. So those are things that I just kind of sought out and came across, and just those are the things that kind of push me forward as an artist. Like when I figure out something new, or I figure out this artist knew this artist, or this artist was connected with this artist, and they did this, and they talked about that in this particular time period and stuff like that. Like I get really excited about that, and that's kind of what keeps me motivated, to just be aware of those things, aware of what's out there already or what came before me, and then I'm trying to just extend the conversation as the artist present day. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, Massimo.
Hi, this is along the lines of your what Jess asked about your studio practice, but I was wondering how you arrived at this very particular sort of combination of sculpture and projection and photography, because I think it's very unique. And I was also wondering if you could speak to the title of your series, Black Alchemy, because I think there's a lot of, on like a chemical level, a lot of problems with representation of race in the history of photography. So yeah, both of those things.
Yeah, great question. Questions. I think how I arrived to this aesthetic, like I owe a lot to abstract geometric painting, like in how space is structured, and my engagement with that. So that definitely fed into some of the aesthetics that I'm interested in, and some of the materials that I use in the studio. Just looking and absorbing different things that I had never experienced before. Because again, I was on a path to become a photojournalist, and I became aware of a few different things within the art world, and I was like, oh, I want to go study art. And then I ended up at Rutgers. It's a longer version of that, but just due to like, literally like, I had lived in Ohio 2 years prior, and then I started going back and photographing Arkansas Delta, where I was from. So I already had that perspective and changed my mind about how I was going to use photography from people use the term straight photography or documentary photography and a bunch of other stuff. So I was basically doing that for a long period of time. And then I didn't really want to do that at Rutgers. One, because it was just extreme to like keep driving back and forth from New Jersey to Arkansas. That was not sustainable. And then I kept thinking about Arkansas, and I kept thinking about the stories from like my grandparents and my parents and my extended family, like my cousins and second cousins and all that. Like I grew up like interacting with those folks on a regular basis, living in one particular place, but then being able to access more rural environments that other family members existed in. It's just like the tradition of like oral history. So like thought about everything I had experienced, everything that I had absorbed, and I started thinking about this idea of reflecting, and then I just started making Xerox prints and inkjet prints, putting them on a wall and re-photographing images. That's how Black Alchemy started. I didn't show any of the earlier images from volume 1 today, but that's how it started. And then this whole idea about black and alchemy, I'm thinking about the color black pictorially, the different hues of blackness, Mars black, ivory black, carbon black. You mix those together, they make different hues, purple, blue, red, and you just treat it like another color on the spectrum, just like yellow or blue. And the idea of blackness as it relates to race. And then I most recently in the last few years, I started thinking about it from like a ontological perspective of like blackness as a state of being. So I started talking about things from that. That's a longer conversation. And then the idea of alchemy, for me, means like putting a bunch of stuff together and seeing what happens. So putting a bunch of stuff in front of a 4x5 camera and photographing it and lighting it and seeing what happens, choosing different materials, being interested in different things, grids, and then the idea of alchemy, taking that 4x5 black and white film and using a chemical process of developing my own film, or choosing to print that film in a darkroom environment where you're using chemicals. We meter and have certain intentions about tones and stuff to how we want things to come out, but the camera sees a different way than we do. And it's still kind of left up to chance, even though we do all this stuff, underdeveloped, overdeveloped, push-pull film, all these kind of strategies to be used to kind of control the zone system. The photograph can still do whatever it wants to do. Like the photographic medium, working in the darkroom and developing film is still a chance for it to like do whatever it wants to do. So it's kind of like a form of magic. So that's how I utilize that terminology, black alchemy, and how I think about both terms in two different ways. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you both for your presentations. I was really interested in your presentation and in your selection of artists that use both abstraction and language.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, in Howardine Pindel's work, where she's using the written numbers in her abstractions, or the painting on the side of the screen. I don't remember the artist's name, but I thought it was really striking with the ovals
Mm-hmm.
and the written documents. And I would like to know if you have any thoughts on the relationship between language and abstraction, like written language and abstraction. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use my own work as an example, like the act of me using Braille, because there's certain language that I'm using, but then like Braille turns. That's a conversation about accessibility as well, for people who only communicate through seeing, right? But then there's people in the world that don't have that benefit, right? And so that's a conversation in and of itself, folded into all of that. But then to take something like Braille and reappropriate it as a visual person, it's still not accessible to me, or still not accessible to people who see. And it's not meant to be engaged in that way primarily. You can think about it or have that perspective as well. So, and the words that I'm using in that Braille are like really jarring words. Like if I was just to write that out using letters, then your reaction to it would probably just be like, okay, that's really harsh, or like, so I'm trying to use what's available to me as a way to kind of slow the viewer down in how they engage with my work. Like that challenge of like, how straightforward am I in what I'm trying to say, or do I use different types of modes of perception or ways to disguise certain things and then present it in a different manner, that also start to have like aesthetic conversations. Because when you start using all those dots, it creates a larger perspective, or a particular perspective in relation to like stepping back from something and looking at something really, really close, and even touching it. Like, are those dots that I put on that paper, on that canvas, like, do they have a capacity to read like Braille should read? So, like that, because I was telling a few of the students today, like, if you just take really, really simple ideas as an artist and you just obsess over them, that's like the best approach to art making. Because if you try to make it too complex or like too dense, like you may get exhausted yourself first. But it's just like how do you balance self-awareness? This is just how I describe it. How do you balance self-awareness with like practicality and make it as basic as possible? But that actually, the most simple stuff and the most basic stuff, like you can obsess over for like your whole career. Like there's like many, many artistic examples of that. Like, so yeah. Yeah.
So maybe we'll take one more question. Uh-oh.
Oh yeah, you choose.
Let's have Vince, since Betsy can ask a question later.
You can ask me after.
I don't know, that was another one. Thank you both for your talks. Aaron, I'm really struck by these images and the whole body of work. I'm struck by the way that you deconstruct and then reconstruct space and how we see it on different levels, what you reveal, what you obscure. And I was particularly drawn to your statement about moving towards this direction because you were not satisfied with the flat two-dimensionality of the photograph. Do you ever think of working three-dimensionally?
Yeah, I do. I didn't bring any examples. They're on my website, but most recently I did this exhibition at WNL University. But the first iteration was at the Houston Center for Photography last year, but I just had a show up there from like September 5th to October 5th, and I have these C-stands, like these photographic C-stands that's so familiar to a very particular set of artists like photographers, and I take these clamps, those standard spring clamps, and I clamp these silk prints to them. The silk print fabric, when you peel it off that adhesive backing, the black is not as black as it would be like on this screen. It just can't have that amount of depth. Light just goes through it, and then over time, sometimes the hue changes to purple, but you can see on both sides of it. So it's like an object. It becomes a sculpture, I guess, if you want to describe it that way, but like choosing to print an image on silk has certain implications and side effects, I guess, to the fact where you can see through it, light can bleed through it. Depending on how you conserve it, it may or may not change colors. So like, that's one way that I've started to explore it. And I've always been interested in the ready-made, and I think for me it's been in relationship to musical instruments. So I'm working on another series. I don't even have a name for it, I don't think, but I'm starting to work with like found musical instruments. And there's two artists that I would give an example that are inspirations for me, like aesthetically, even going down this path, is the late artist Terry Atkins, and then one of his proteges, basically, I don't know if that's the right word, forgive me, Jamal, if that's the wrong word to use, but the one artist that studied under him is Jamal Cyrus. Very, very interesting artist. He has this performance where he deep fries a tenor sax. So like, and so it's just like, I don't know, I just think that's pretty amazing to just even make that decision as an artist, and then he has his own choices, and you can hear from him, you can see the performance on YouTube and different things like that. He has a very particular way that he talks about that, and very particular engagement with music and art making and different things like that that's pretty brilliant, and I have some of the same interests as him. So it's just, but it's like I wouldn't even, like I have to be aware of those artists, I think, for me to even go down that path. So that's that discursive enterprise, like being aware of what's going on and what happened before you even decided to become an artist, that kind of thing, and what's happening now as I make and different things like that. So I am, and I really like David Hammond's work a lot, and his whole connection to Duchamp and like the subversion of that whole thing. There's a lot of subversion in that, and people like Gordon Matta Clark. There's so many interviews that I've read about different artists that talk about his restaurant Food. I think it was called Food, and it was like around for about 2 years, but like I don't know. I'll probably estimate about half the people that I talked about here, or half the people that Jess mentioned, probably went to Food and interacted with one another. So that's an important part of art history. And then David Hammond's, I think the thing is called Days In. The Whitney, I haven't even seen it in person, but somehow he got the Whitney to build this gigantic thing as basically a dedication to Gordon Matta Clark. And, a past performance that he did, cut inside that, like an existing structure on that harbor that used to exist there. I think it's what you would call it. But yeah, I went down the rabbit hole there, but yeah, I am interested in, I am engaging in 3D objects, and I'm constantly battling with that whole thing about the 2D image and how to just, where to go from there. Yeah.
I'm excited to see.
Say that again. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, in some way. I can't really articulate it right now, but yeah, in some way. Yeah. Thank you.
I am looking forward to seeing what you do to musical instruments in the deep
Yeah.
fryer or otherwise.
Yeah, I'm excited
Um,
about it.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it at that for now.
All right.
And I just really want to thank Erin again and thank all of you and welcome you to come back and see the show and read our catalog. And Erin, thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thank you, Jess.